Thank you for attending the Appalachian Housing Needs Assessment webinar. Our hosts today are Mel Jones and Jim King. Mel Jones is the Associate Director of the Virginia Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech, and Jim King is the CEO and President of Fahe. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. All microphones for the people who are attending directly from Zoom are muted. If you have any questions, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and type your questions. And then after the presentation is done for about the second half of the webinar, we'll be answering those. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. If anybody's questions go unanswered today, we'll send out emails as a follow-up to try to answer those. And we'll make sure that everybody gets a good idea of the questions that were asked. Other things is that, as I said before, this is a live broadcast, but it's also being recorded. Once we get the recording gathered up, we'll have that live on our website for people to download to watch later on. And with no further ado, Jim King and Mel Jones.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really glad to have a good turnout, and especially glad to have Mel Jones with us. It's a pleasure always to speak with you, Mel. And last year, we commissioned you to do a housing needs assessment for our primary service area, which is the Appalachian portions of Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Alabama. And I think you came up with some really interesting findings, and we've been talking about what those are, but we wanted to share those with folks today. And then have some time, I hope, after your presentation and a little bit of dialogue between you and I, we'll open it up and would love to hear questions and comments and thoughts from each of you all. So, keep track of those questions as they come up. So Mel, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Okay, sounds great. Give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, hi everybody. You should now be able to see slides. If for some reason you can't, throw up a flag, but I think that you probably can. So again, I'm Mel Jones. I'm a research scientist and the Associate Director of the Virginia Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech. I like to let everyone know that we are a state research center and a university center, and that means that we have a dual mission. One is to serve communities across Virginia, thinking about housing needs and housing assessments. But then as a university research center, we like to tackle big problems and really create innovative solutions for the nation at large. And so this study is part of that mission, and really important to me personally because my family is from Appalachian, Kentucky, and trying to understand rural housing issues, particularly how to measure them using data, is an interest of mine. So we'll dive right in, give you a little bit of background information on this study. So we examined housing and household data from the American Community Survey, the Consolidated Housing Affordability Strategy, which is a HUD tabulation of the American Community Survey, but offers us some really unique data that otherwise it would be very hard for us to program. And then the American Community Survey Public Use Microdata Sample, which allows us to construct unique tables that aren't available published on American Fact Finder, for example. And as Jim explained, we looked mostly at Central Appalachia and then the Appalachian portion of Alabama. So 58% of our study area is urban. Sometimes that surprises people when we're talking about Appalachia, but particularly in Appalachian, Tennessee and Appalachian, Alabama, we have very large metropolitan statistical areas. And in each state, we actually do have metropolitan statistical areas, and we like to note that these are very well-defined markets. MSAs are delineated based on the strength of commuting patterns, and people tend to buy their home within a reasonable distance of their job, or vice versa, find a job within a reasonable distance of their home. So MSAs are a very good approximation of housing markets, and where we could look at MSAs in our study area, we tried to look at them as a whole market. Then we also, of course, have rural areas, and these rural areas tend to gravitate toward MSAs, towns in some cases, or very often corridors, so streets or roads that connect MSAs will often act as a center of more rural markets. And then finally, or employment centers. So we do have factories or other sort of distribution centers that act as a gravitational pull for housing. But it is important to note that really conditions and challenges, as well as opportunities, vary widely throughout our region. The division between urban and rural is a very simplistic division, but when you look at states, when you look at particular areas, you find a lot of uniqueness to each of these markets, submarkets too. So before we dive into the data, I want to talk generally about some market trends that provide context for everything that we're going to talk about. Challenges really nationwide, we're looking at a dearth of new construction, particularly of starter homes. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, we saw a lot of consolidation of construction firms, builders, and developers, and we saw a lot of very small builders and developers actually drop out of the market. In Appalachia, this has really had an impact of some areas not having any builders, no developers. So introducing new construction can be quite difficult. In some places, and this is not the majority of Appalachia, but in some places, we see decreasing values, and it is leading us to believe that there are certainly areas in Appalachia that are facing problems with irrelevant or even obsolete housing, as in the person who lives there now may be the last person to live there because of an economic shift, because of, well, generally because of an economic shift, but sometimes because of geographical issues or changes. Think about flooding, for example. This housing has become irrelevant. And when you're faced with irrelevant housing, or you are the owner of it, you may not be able to extract the value of it when you want to move. So this is a particular concern for folks who are aging and maybe moving into, let's say, assisted living or downsizing. If they're not able to extract the value of that asset, it may be very hard for them to move into a more appropriate home. But in the face of all of these challenges, there are certainly opportunities. We think of millennials as being a great opportunity for much of Appalachia and many rural areas. We're just starting to be able to take a close look at millennials and their housing preferences. And as we do so, we're realizing that not all of them want to live in the big cities like so many people have thought. Really, more than half of them want to live in suburban or rural contexts. And although they're still looking for the similar lifestyle that they would get in an urban area, so think about walkability, convenience. They don't want a big house, they don't want a big yard, they want something that they can easily maintain. But one thing that is really key to what they're looking for is a community. And so often in a rural small town, they can find that community and that convenience that they would find, that they would not necessarily be able to find in an urban area, and certainly would not be able to find as affordably. Further, along with the millennials, we're seeing this sort of gig economy and more folks working from home. So even though their job center may not be in that rural area, we're finding that they have the opportunity to live there. Another opportunity we see is manufactured housing. I'm always careful to say that this is not a silver bullet solution. It is simply an opportunity. So where we don't have builders, where we need to introduce new housing, manufactured and modular housing can be a great solution, particularly as manufactured housing is becoming far more energy efficient. In the same breath, I'll mention that many people in Appalachia are living in extremely inefficient mobile homes and some manufactured housing, and replacement of those mobile homes with new, let's say, Energy Star manufactured housing is a great opportunity to increase affordability. And then finally, I want to talk about affordability as an opportunity. So in Virginia, for example, we see very high levels of cost burden, particularly in what we call the urban crescent, so Northern Virginia, Richmond, and the Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. So we're starting to see an increase in growth on what we call the reverse crescent, so I-81, which is, I'm located sort of at the southern part of that in Blacksburg, Virginia, where Virginia Tech is. We are also part of Appalachia. We're starting to see an increased growth on that side of Virginia because it is more affordable. People have access to home ownership. And in addition to being sort of part of the American dream, as we like to say, home ownership is a really important way of building wealth, particularly among the middle class in the US. So in lieu of any other opportunity to build wealth, home ownership is a very important component of what people are seeking when they're looking for a place to put down roots. I'm not advancing, hold on. There we go. So we mostly thought about housing needs and the costs of housing and the ability to ascertain housing among households, but we did take also a look a little bit at the structures themselves and tried to think somewhat about conditions. The best way to demonstrate what we thought about is by looking at housing units by year built, which is what you have in front of you. You'll see that the majority of housing was built between 1970 and 2009. Any housing that is 50 or more years old is usually either has been upgraded or needs upgrade. We find that in West Virginia and Virginia, this is a little bit more skewed toward the older housing stock. And so the largest number of 1939 and before housing units is actually in West Virginia. The important thing to note is that in the landscape of housing affordability challenges that we're really experiencing nationwide right now, people don't have a lot of opportunity to save and invest in their homes. So particularly the baby boomers have experienced through much of their careers stagnant incomes in the face of increased housing costs. And it has meant that much of this older stock has not been upgraded and has not been well maintained. And so in many communities across Appalachia and really across the nation, we're facing somewhat of a housing crisis where we had a big housing boom in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And much of that stock needs upgrade, but has not indeed been upgraded. And so with that, I'll move on to our affordability challenges. So in the urban areas of Appalachia, we really found that high rents and intense competition for affordable units were the primary affordability challenges. Not to diminish the fact that homeowners also experience affordability challenges, but it is certainly most intense among renters. In the rural areas, we have mostly homeowners, and so those who are housing cost burden are likely to be owners. At the same time, we have very few affordable rental units. So those who need rental units or maybe need to transition as they downsize into a rental unit, we have very few opportunities for that. And the economics of some areas is causing rental units to be in very high demand and increasing the prices of them. We also see very high utility expenditures in the rural areas, and this can be indicative of housing conditions as well. So not only do we see very high utility expenditures among folks with mobile homes, so older mobile homes pre-1976, we also just see high utility expenditures generally. And in addition to the deterioration of one's home as it is constructed, as appliances get older, they also use more energy. And so we generally kind of see this as being indicative of needing reinvestment in housing. And that brings me to this idea of low quality housing. So if folks are living in a home that was built 50s, 60s, 70s, and has not been maintained and has not been upgraded. They are looking at low quality housing. So now we'll move into the experience of householders. So this in front of you, you see housing cost burden by state. So you can see the percent of those who are cost burden paying more than 30% of their income for housing. We talk about people who pay 30% of their income for housing or more as being cost burden because they are likely to have to make choices between housing and other things that they need. So think about medical care, think about education, sometimes even food and clothing. We really start looking at choices between basic necessities when we're talking about severely cost burden households. So those spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And we really do believe that these folks are the ones that, that are making those choices between housing and, let's say, food. It's important to note, and I always like to say that this is based on a rule of thumb. So it used to be you shouldn't spend more than 25% of your income on housing. And later it was adopted through policy, this 30% rule. And academics have taken a lot of time thinking about this. Is it the right number? And it has been pretty well substantiated. And the most interesting point that I'll make is Newman in the literature suggests that the moment that someone spends less than 30% of their income on housing is the moment they start spending on their child's educational enrichment outside of school. So now you have a little bit of different cut of cost burden households. Here it's by income level for each state. And you can see, this is not percent, it's the number. So Alabama and Tennessee are the most urbanized areas with the highest populations in our study area. So that's why they have quite a few households that are cost burdened. But if you look proportionally, you'll find that Kentucky is the one where we see almost all of those folks who are housing cost burdened are low income households. And that's what we expect. So folks with low incomes are disproportionately cost burdened. In places like Alabama and Tennessee, where we're more urbanized, we're starting to see this national trend in urban areas that cost burden is actually becoming a problem in higher and higher incomes. So those making moderate incomes, those even making up to 120% of area median income, we're starting to see higher levels of cost burden. I should note that in none of these cases do we see cost burden being dominated by folks who are at or below the poverty line. So in some places, you can see a concentration of poverty is really what is leading to the housing challenges. But here, it seems throughout our study area that housing challenges are related more to the disproportionate or the higher cost of housing as related to incomes rather than extremely low wages or poverty. And here you have the percent of total households that rent compared to the percent of cost burden households that rent. And comparing these two numbers, you see that renting households are disproportionately cost burdened by quite a lot. So renters have, I want to say, less control over their housing costs. So when you get a mortgage to buy a home, generally the mortgage finance process doesn't allow you to be cost burdened at the onset. And your housing costs, except for insurance and utilities, are fairly well smooth through your ownership of the home. And in the aftermath of the Great Recession, those who were able to maintain home ownership were really able to take advantage of refinancing to lower interest rates. So we've generally seen the cost of owned housing going down. Renters, on the other hand, in the aftermath of the Great Recession, we see many people transferring from home ownership to renting. So we have an increased demand for rental units, and we've seen a much steeper increase in the cost of rental units. So it makes sense that renters have become disproportionately cost burdened. For this study, we also, in each MSA, were able to complete a housing affordability gap analysis. And this chart looks confusing at first, but we like to take these sets of columns one by one and sort of talk you through what you can see here. So this is in Charleston, West Virginia, and we're looking at owned or for sale stock. If you look at the left two most columns, you have in blue and green the households, and then in yellow, gray, and light blue, you have the housing stock. So we're comparing households to housing stock. And in Charleston, those households in the two leftmost columns, those households earning less than or equal to 50% of AMI. So we're looking at very low income households here. You see about half of those households are cost burdened, and about half are not cost burdened. So if you can remember back to the chart we were looking at before, West Virginia is the least cost burdened among all of the states, or the Appalachian portions of other states. And then you see on the right column, so the yellow and gray one, our housing stock. So we have enough housing stock to serve those households making less than or equal to 50% of AMI, but there's some nuance to this. So the different colors in the housing stock column, the yellow indicates that the households occupying that stock actually make higher incomes than they need to afford that stock. So the reason that there are still cost burden folks in this population is because they don't actually have access to all of this housing that would be affordable to them. And so what do? They move into one of the higher costs housing. Essentially, they either must accept a housing cost burden or must accept substandard housing in order to access housing at all. So when we move into the next set of columns, we see this new color showing up in the right side, which is this orange color. And that indicates that people who do not really have enough income to comfortably afford their home are occupying that stock. So these households that are cost burdened in the less than or equal to 50% of AMI are actually going up and living in housing that's affordable to people making 50 to 80 or 80 to 100% of AMI, because they simply cannot compete with the higher income households who are occupying that affordable stock. We like to talk about this competition. So households with higher incomes compete better for housing. They're more attractive to landlords. They maybe have a longer rental history. They can certainly show a larger paycheck, or they're more attractive to mortgage finance agencies. They're a surer bet. So in a way, they get first dibs, first choice of housing. And then those with lower incomes get to choose next, and lower incomes next. And really those left at the bottom, extremely low or very low income households, choose from what's left. And as I mentioned before, they often choose between substandard housing and housing cost burden. Can look at the same analysis for renter households. So again, we're here in Charleston, West Virginia. And now, if again, we're looking at the left two most columns, we see that the number of households making less than or equal to 30% of AMI is actually greater than the physical stock of housing units to serve that group. In addition to a shortage of physical stock, we have that crowding out effect again. So again, we look at the yellow and we see that almost half of that stock is occupied by people making higher incomes. The gray is indicative that people are consuming sort of within their income bracket. And because we have a shortage of stock here and the crowding out, and then if we jump to the next two columns, again, here we don't have a shortage in physical units, but we do have, again, that crowding out. So we're starting to see big blocks of orange, which indicates that people are accepting cost burden very likely. The other thing to address here is the light blue at the bottom of each stock column, which indicates vacancies. You might ask, well, there are cost burden people in the 30 to 50% of AMI category, and there are vacant units in the 30 to 50% of AMI category. Why? This is likely the stock that doesn't meet people's needs. So it's in very bad condition, it's not well located, and so instead of living there, people are willing to pay a little extra to live in something that it may present somewhat of a cost burden to them. Or indeed, people may choose to underconsume housing because that doesn't meet their needs. So often we think that if there was a way to meet the needs of folks at higher income levels, we might get some, at least, of those people to vacate those affordable units. However, it is very important to note that if someone can pay less than 30% of their income for housing, they are absolutely going to do that. If they can find a house that meets their needs and costs less than 30% of their income, they will. I often tell people I spend about 15% of my income on housing. So it is not a reasonable expectation to believe that all of these people would vacate, but it could be at least a portion of them. And then this is just to show you quickly Winchester, Virginia, West Virginia MSA. We have a little bit of a different scenario here. I'm going to flip back to Charleston. If you look at the two rightmost columns in Charleston, you see only a little bit more stock to serve the 80 to 100% of AMI category than households. That's somewhat unusual. Winchester is a little bit more typical in what we see, as we work in communities across Virginia and really the nation. So we see an increase in stock at sort of the highest level. But still we have a major crowding out effect, again, indicated by those large sets of yellow. So actually more than half of the housing units in each of these three categories are occupied by people making more income than they need to comfortably afford their unit. And so again, you have to ask yourself, if we were to build more in sort of the 80 to 100% of AMI category, could we balance this out a little bit and give access to folks who are currently experiencing cost burden to find a home that is within their reach? And then my final slide, we talked a while back in this presentation about utility costs. And so here you have median utility costs as a percentage of household income. And it demonstrates that particularly in the heart of Appalachia here, Eastern Kentucky, far Southwest Virginia, and Eastern, Southeastern, West Virginia, we have people who are likely cost burdened by utilities alone. And that really indicates the substandard housing again. So your heating and air is just leaking out of your house, and you're facing utility bills, sometimes $1,000 in the winter time. And that could likely be more than you pay for your house. In addition, we find people who live without electricity for certain months in order to try to save. In Alabama, we see again some of those very high utility costs, and digging into this a little bit more, in a previous study, we found that that's primarily related to cooling loads. But again, we're looking at folks who are possibly cost burdened by utilities alone. So that's the highlights of the study, but certainly doesn't delve into all of the details or even all of the topics in the report. So feel free, if you have questions on other things, to talk about those too.
Thank you, Mel. while folks are queuing up their questions, I'll get us started with a couple that I already have on my mind. We usually try to describe the region, Appalachia and Central Appalachia, more particularly for us, pretty simplistically, like it's a place, one place. But how would you describe it? I mean, I think that came out in some pieces that you saw, but it's not one place.
No, not at all, really. So many urban places throughout Appalachia that are acting as housing markets. And then many rural places near, in between, along corridors that are acting as their own housing markets. And I should mention that each of these markets has submarkets, and they really experience different housing challenges. So one thing that demonstrates this is when we look at housing plus transportation costs, we can find that people with very high and very low housing plus transportation costs actually live easily in the same jurisdiction, or even almost right on top of each other. And it's simply because of access. So this town can access the highway fairly readily. This other town has to take a long route to the highway, for example. So each of these markets and submarkets are really experiencing very different conditions.
So a little bit more, this is more like a communities of Appalachia study, I think, in some ways, and that we probably need to parse each of these different markets a little differently in terms of what solutions we're offering, as well as what kind of policy that it takes to react to that.
Absolutely.
You also mentioned this notion of a lack of moderate income housing stock, or at least housing that is appropriate to that income level. What thoughts do you have around either incentives or subsidy? Like, what if you had the magic wand? What would you suggest we might consider doing in response to that?
Right. I think that part of the solution is taking a hard look at land use and what may be precluding building this moderate income housing. So a lot of what we see nationally is the market catering to higher income luxury markets. And part of that is due to the extremely restricted land and costs. The other issue is that in this consolidation of the construction industry and of developers, and seeing many of those smaller ones that were maybe more responsive to the market dropping out, really localities are starting to have to try to attract builders, attract developers that can build the housing that they know that they need. So that's another way to start thinking about this problem. A magic wand solution, if you will, Jim, and we talked about this before a little bit, but if we could only facilitate the transaction among households so that lower income households actually had an opportunity to compete when affordable houses come up for sale, would be another just magical option. I don't want to say magical because I know that there's a creative way to facilitate that, but it's something that no one's doing right now.
I like the word magical. It sounds very Disney-like. So when I looked at the data from the study, and this is not my wheelhouse per se, but you point out in sort of an overarching view that it's 3.8 million households in this area, and when you begin to look at the number of cost burden, just the raw number, renters and homeowners together, it's 988,000 households. I mean, so it's a pretty large number. I think roughly a quarter of all households. 570,000 households that are cost burden that are renters, but I think it's also really important to note 418,000 households that are homeowners. And so while the percent for homeowners is not nearly as high, that sort of disproportionate burden for renters, just because of the sheer amount of home ownership in the region, you still end up with hundreds of thousands of housing units that are at risk. And I just have a couple other little data points, and you can react to these and tell me if I made up something or not. The severe,
I think that
severely burdened households still runs in over 200,000, whether they're homeowners, and 280,000 of renter households. So we have actually got, it's not quite equal, but in a real general sense, it is nearly an equal number of households that we need to deal with in sort of both types. Am I making that up? Does that seem?
That seems that is exactly what we wrote. And the home ownership piece is not insignificant for so many reasons. Again, homeowners, when they're cost burdened, they are not saving for an emergency, they are not putting money into their home, and their home may be deteriorating. And not only is that something that threatens them individually, it also threatens neighborhoods and communities. We're talking about a deteriorating housing stock generally at the community, for the community at large. And again, talking again about the individual, if you're seeing that asset deteriorate, you're seeing your wealth deteriorate, you're going to have a harder time moving on from that house. But in addition, it is bringing down the value of your neighbors' homes, and it is, in a way, gutting your community a little bit because you're seeing lower tax revenues, but also in the face of this, situation where we don't have a lot of new construction, it's becoming even more important to preserve our existing housing units.
Great. I think we're trying to monitor to see if there are questions folks want to post. Remember to use the Q&A tab. Is that right?
Yeah, you can use the Q&A tab. I've had one or two people tell me they can't see it, so the chat tab is also a viable option. We're monitoring both of those.
So moving along then, hopefully that if folks have questions, we'll be able to get to them. Apologize for any difficulty with that. One other piece of data, and this will kind of sort of move this conversation to a slightly different direction. Utility burden, which was the last slide that you offered, 248,000 households in our service area have utility burden and would be otherwise considered cost burden just on the utilities alone, meaning they're spending 30% of their income on utilities, which leads to all kind of cliche-ish kind of, notions like, their income is going out the window, literally. And for us, we talk about that as, forcing people between choosing to eat or heat. So then, forgive me for the cute dialogue to that, but that is usually a part of the housing conversation. And I think most of us who are practitioners experience on a daily basis is never part of like the national dialogue of the housing crisis in our country. And maybe it's not a crisis in other places, but these are going to be, this is more where homeowners have a disproportionate weight that is carried here. And we're seeing as much as 55% of people's income going for utilities in the winter. So we really do have a crisis of folks who are so desperate that they can't even move from where they are, yet it doesn't serve them at all.
Yeah. And, there are some folks who are really looking at truly needing to move. Their home is substandard to the point that it cannot be revived. Other households, with simple interventions in terms of retrofit and some rehabilitation could see highly decreased utility bills. And then we talked about mobile home replacement as being part of the solution as well. Utility prices are not going down, and it really puts people in an extremely vulnerable position, because again, this is most severely impacting those with extremely low, very low incomes. And when we talk about people being cost burdened or severely cost burdened in that extremely low and even the very low income, we're really looking at folks who are at risk for homelessness or even displacement, other kinds of larger even problems. Yeah.
So one of the questions that we got posted, which I feel like you're kind of hitting on here, Mel, is the utility cost burden really a matter of energy efficiency in the home?
So we suspect that. We don't have good data on the conditions of those homes in terms of, had they been rehabbed. But when we look at the trajectory of utility prices, and then also the trajectory of utility costs for homeowners, it would seem to indicate that it has more to do with the condition of their home rather than an increase in utility costs, for example.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. Is that right? Okay. So,
Oh, I'm seeing a question.
Yeah, there's a question from Kim.
Mm-hmm. It says, how do localities attract construction companies and builders who are more responsive to the needs of the local market? There have been lots of creative approaches to this. So Floyd County out near me recently held a developer summit to try to help developers understand the housing needs in the community. And that was sort of just a meeting of people who were looking to build or wanted new housing and those who might build it. But out in rural Iowa, they have another solution, which is they attract or create an agreement with a developer that is from a different place, so not rural Iowa, to come to the town and build if they can find enough homeowners or potential homeowners who want to build in order to make it worth their while. And then once they get that developer there and building, folks pile on, and they have successfully shown that builder that the market is there. The other thing is really trying to cultivate homegrown builders. So really in the construction industry, we're seeing an aging industry. We like to say that the median age of a building official is between 50 and 60, similar for many of the trades. And there is a more basic policy, educational policy piece to this, which is we need to get more folks into the trades, and we need to be cultivating those homegrown builders who can more readily respond to market demands. But in the meantime, actively trying to attract builders and developers from nearest by as you can has been a successful strategy for some rural communities.
Looks like there's a question here about regarding affording housing upgrades when housing is not holding value, which is certainly some part of our region, and folks are not able to borrow against the value of their home or lack the income to do so. What might the policy remedies be or financial remedies? I'm not sure I would even start with policy per se. I mean, I think I think markets come in different types. And so even just ones that are having difficulty holding value, some are on the upswing. I think that makes up some large part of what I would consider true Central Appalachia, is that we see evidence that markets can be dealt with if you make the right if you make investments in decent homes, you try to meet the market where they will appraise a little bit better, you can actually build the market. Because we just have places where we haven't had enough construction consistent over time to have comparables, so that the market has really suffered. So I think you just have to spur, not very different from the way you answered that last question, Mel. I think there is something about spurring activity, and I think policy-wise, we can't have just focus on just the lowest households and lowest incomes. We have to think across a broader spectrum of incomes in those communities if we're going to rebuild the market. I think there are places, and it would be wrong to deny it, that the market is collapsing pretty quickly around a community, and it isn't likely, at least in the foreseeable future, that anything can return there. Where you have like more decay in the housing stock than can be addressed in a ready amount of time. I think policy-wise, we can't just turn our backs on those places either, and there has to be some kind of response. We do through our membership a number of different kinds of volunteer ministries where it's just trying to help people stay where they're at, because there isn't an alternative, or the Appalachia Heat Squad, where it's just energy retrofits that help people get the most out of the home they already have.
So we have another question coming from Facebook.
Okay.
Do manufactured homes drive down the value of a traditional brick and mortar home in the study areas?
So we have not really studied that in a broad sense with comparing, when you introduce a manufactured home to a market that didn't have it before, and what does that do to overall values. However, this has been looked at nationwide, and the consensus among academics is that this does not have a negative impact. In fact, with the new manufactured homes, if they're introduced into a neighborhood, generally they need to be on a foundation, often, chassis removed. And once you're looking at a manufactured home that's on a foundation, has a porch built on, often has a modular garage, you're not looking at a house that is really still a manufactured home. And in many states, you can now transfer a home that is seated on the correct foundation into real estate. And so it really shouldn't at that point be considered even a manufactured home. So even though that was the original process. So I think that it should not have a negative impact. The larger question is, can you find somebody to appraise it correctly? And that has been a bigger challenge.
I think I would totally agree with that. I think manufactured housing is at times something that has either been touted as a panacea approach to affordable housing in some markets, or has been stigmatized to be like nothing but, worthless, or is just not wanted. I think it falls somewhere in the middle, and they're just like any kind of construction. You have construction that is done well, and you have construction that's done poorly, and it really is about what the standard is for the final product, regardless if it's site built or factory built. It does seem that our experience has been that that they're not only is it hard to get that appraisal on the front end, the refinance of any kind of manufactured unit kind of hurts the potential of any kind of wealth creation. Some of the benefits you would get from a site-built home, just because the market hasn't caught up to whether or not that right, like, do folks want to finance it? Right.
And we see the same trend in highly energy efficient site-built homes. Yeah. So when we're looking at new energy technologies, particularly renewables, it is again experiencing challenges in the appraisal process. But we've seen so much adoption of new technologies and manufactured components of homes are becoming more popular. And I think that as this becomes more readily accepted as a way of building, even when we're talking about sort of stick or site built homes, we'll start to see that appraising will just have to conform and learn how to appraise.
Looks like we got a question about credit barrier. Were credit barriers throughout different income levels considered as a part of this study? Credit barriers.
No, not really. Just tangentially, from other studies, we think about credit barriers, but not specifically as part of the study. Any thoughts? So certainly folks with lower incomes or certain backgrounds have a harder time accessing credit. And sometimes, we see folks choosing like a chattel loan over a mortgage, for example, or choosing to rent because they simply can't get a mortgage. But also I want to note that when I've been talking to lenders as a part of another study in the New River Valley of Virginia, they're noting that they're trying to deal with these housing affordability problems, and they're trying to create new products. In addition, local governments are starting to try to bridge some of these credit barriers. And what I'm starting to hear is that it's more of a problem with potential home buyers not knowing how to piece together, or not even knowing to even start to interact with, let's say, a HUD housing counselor or a bank and try to get toward home ownership. So there's more than just the credit barrier problem here. Jim, you probably know a lot more about this than I do.
No, I think I thought you did that very well. I wanted to see if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to offer. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that the better part of an hour went by really quickly.
Sure did. Let's see, final thoughts. Don't lose sight of the opportunities. Don't get bogged down in our housing challenges. It's a nationwide challenge right now. So Appalachia is in that way not unique, and we are good problem solvers here in Appalachia. And I think that if we focus on the opportunities to build in towns and places where millennials and the following generations are going to want to live because they offer a higher quality of life, and in ways they offer more opportunity, I think that we can indeed jumpstart some of these housing markets. And it is just a matter of being innovative, accepting innovation in terms of building, and really working to build on the strength of the community.
It's great. I wanted to give a reaction to the study overall before we called it one for the books here. So it looked to us like as you just to take a crack at this overall study, there's really three different issues that really come to the forefront to us about housing in Appalachia. One's about home buyer affordability, one's renter affordability, and then the last is really what I would call the heart of Appalachia, right? Sort of the coal field, more centric part of the region where you do end up with a different set of problems. And so I wanted to just walk through those really quickly as we're thinking about how to react to that. Home buyer and home ownership is kind of central to the mission as we thought about it. But as we look at this notion of modest income households and their housing needs, we've been building out a broker network that includes our members, but we'll want to expand that as it makes sense to try to put more mortgage credit closer to these communities. And we're not the only ones in this space, but it just seems like there isn't enough good credit available at a lot of competitive choices in some communities. So we're just coming online with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as seller servicers, so we have access to a much bigger window, and some products like construction to permanent loans, so that it's a single close, and those kinds of things. On the renter side, I mean, I think we were successful with a bond issue, that a CDFI bond guarantee that allowed us to do some fixed rate long-term rental housing lending to go along with some of the tax credit work we've traditionally done. And so we're going to go through another round of that. We just see that spurs a certain activity where that credit doesn't always go where it needs to, and we feel like that ought to matter. And so we're just joining a whole lot of other folks in that, but there seems to be more. I think that the more distressed counties of the region, that some of what I just said matters a little less for those places. It's not to say it has zero value, but there is a need for existing homeowners to have some assistance in bringing the house up. Not always around code, but really about safety, soundness, and just basic heat. And in Alabama, we'll give them air conditioning for that, right? So the other, which didn't come out in this study quite the same way, but I think it's indicative of what the data shows, is that aging population to go along with the utility burden. So it's somebody who owns their house, they don't owe a payment. Utilities and maintenance are the thing they've got, and that's going to tend to be older folks. And how we need to address the growing elder population in the region, I think is something that we'd like to get ahead of. And so my final three thoughts on all of it is to say, this is all a really complicated market. Thank you for helping unpack that a bit, Mel. And that we're trying some new approaches, but it won't be enough. What we do on our own. And I do think, lastly, we'd really like to call on having a review of the basic funding opportunities and how those are prioritized, as well as some policy implications into how we ought to respond to this kind of study. Because I think we have new information, we ought to have new approaches to go with it.
There you go.
So, well, thank you again for taking the time to share with us. It was a pleasure to work with you again, and it won't be the last time if it's up to me.
Hope not.
Appreciate everybody's attendance on this. I hope you found it valuable. We'll be posting the study, and there will be some blog posts that go out that kind of hit some of these points that'll bring you back to our website with a little deeper dive on some of this. If you would rather not go hunting or waiting for us to post, and you would like to just get a copy of the study, if you will use my email address at jim@fahe.org, and we'll make sure to get that out to you. And with that, thank you all again. Have a great afternoon.
You too.